The massive communication array on Earth's moon buzzed to life at exactly 1432 Universal Time. The signal was strong, clear, and impossible to ignore. It came from somewhere beyond the outer edge of the solar system, carrying a message that would change everything. In the Pentagon's deepest war room, Admiral Sarah Chen stood before a wall of monitors displaying star charts, fleet positions, and defense networks. The room was filled with the highest-ranking military officials from every major nation on Earth. They had been called together for an emergency session, though none of them knew exactly why. The transmission began with a burst of alien symbols that scrolled across the screens. Then, impossibly, the symbols shifted and changed until they formed words that everyone could understand. The translation technology was beyond anything humans had developed, which made the message even more unsettling. "Attention, primitive inhabitants of the Sol system," the voice began. It was cold, mechanical, and carried an unmistakable tone of superiority. "You are hereby addressed by Emperor Vexthan of the Zephyrian Galactic Empire, ruler of 847 star systems, commander of 10,000 worlds." Admiral Chen exchanged glances with General Martinez, who sat to her right. The general's eyebrows were raised so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. Around the room, other officers leaned forward in their chairs, listening intently to every word. The alien emperor continued his speech without pause. "Your pathetic single-system civilization has been evaluated by our intelligence networks. We have observed your crude technology, your primitive weapons, and your backward social structures. You are deemed unfit to exist in our galaxy without proper supervision." General Rodriguez, the head of the Air Force, made a small snorting sound. He quickly covered it with a cough, but Admiral Chen noticed the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Therefore, the Emperor's voice boomed through the speakers. "The Zephyrian Galactic Empire hereby demands your immediate and unconditional surrender. You will submit to our authority within one rotation of your primary star. Failure to comply will result in the complete destruction of your homeworld and all colonies." The message continued with a detailed list of humanity's supposed weaknesses. The Emperor described their laughable kinetic weapons with obvious disdain. He mocked their chemical rockets and called their nuclear technology ancient and ineffective. He spoke of their lack of energy shields, their primitive computing systems, and their inability to travel faster than light. "Your warships are built from crude metals," the Emperor declared. "Your weapons fire solid projectiles like the tools of savages. You have not even developed basic plasma technology or gravitational manipulation. Against the might of the Zephyrian fleet, you would last approximately 4 of your planetary rotations." That was when General Martinez lost it. He tried to hold back, really tried, but a small chuckle escaped his lips, then another. Within seconds he was laughing so hard he had to excuse himself from the room. Admiral Chen watched him go, then turned her attention back to the transmission. The Emperor was still talking, describing in great detail how easy it would be to destroy Earth's defenses. He mentioned their scanning technology, which had identified major military installations around the world. He spoke confidently about orbital bombardment and planetary suppression. "We have conquered 312 species across this galaxy," the Emperor continued. "Each one believed they could resist us. Each one was wrong. Your fate will be no different unless you surrender immediately." General Kim, who had been silent until now, made a small sound that might have been a snicker. She quickly composed herself, but Admiral Chen could see the amusement in her eyes. The transmission went on for nearly 20 minutes. The Emperor described the power of Zephyrian energy weapons, their impenetrable shields, and their vast fleet of warships. He explained how their technology was thousands of years more advanced than anything humans had developed. He painted a picture of complete technological superiority that should have terrified anyone listening. Instead, the room was filled with barely contained laughter. General Martinez returned just as the Emperor was finishing his speech. His face was red from trying not to laugh, and he had to bite his lip to maintain his composure. "You have been warned," the Emperor concluded. "Surrender now, or face the consequences of defying the Zephyrian Galactic Empire. Our fleet will arrive at your system shortly to receive your response. Choose wisely, primitive ones." The transmission ended, leaving the room in silence for exactly 3 seconds. Then General Rodriguez burst out laughing. Not a small chuckle or a quiet snicker, but a full, belly-deep laugh that echoed off the walls. Within moments, the entire room had joined him. Admiral Chen tried to maintain her composure, but even she couldn't help smiling. She had spent 30 years in the military, climbing from lieutenant to admiral through some of the most dangerous conflicts in human history. She had seen war in all its forms, from small border skirmishes to the massive cyber warfare campaigns that had defined the early 21st century. And now these aliens, these supposedly superior beings, were threatening humanity based on what they thought they knew about human warfare. "Crude kinetic weapons," General Kim said between laughs. "They think our guns are primitive." "Chemical rockets," added General Rodriguez, wiping tears from his eyes. "They have no idea what we're really capable of." Admiral Chen walked to her command console and began pulling up files that most people didn't know existed. Project Damocles, Operation Omega Point, the Samson Protocol. Decades of preparation for threats that might never come. Contingencies planned by the most paranoid military minds in human history. "They scanned our installations," she said quietly, and the laughter began to die down. "They saw our conventional forces, our regular military bases, our standard equipment." She turned to face the room, and her smile was cold and sharp. "They have no idea what we keep hidden." The alien emperor had made a fundamental error in judgment. He had looked at humanity's surface technology and assumed it represented their full capabilities. He had seen a single-system species with chemical rockets and kinetic weapons, and concluded they were helpless against superior technology. What he hadn't considered was that humanity was the only species in the galaxy that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of warfare. While other civilizations had developed advanced technology for peaceful purposes, humans had been finding new and creative ways to destroy each other, since they first picked up sticks and stones. The Emperor thought he was dealing with a primitive species that would surrender at the first show of force. Instead, he had just declared war on the most militarily experienced civilization in the galaxy. Admiral Chen began issuing orders, and around the world, ancient protocols activated. Hidden facilities powered up, classified weapon systems came online, and in bunkers and bases that didn't officially exist, soldiers and scientists began preparing for a war that would teach the galaxy an important lesson about underestimating humanity. Fleet Commander Thexmal stood on the bridge of the massive warship Eternal Dominion, watching the star charts update as his fleet moved toward the Sol system. Around him, 1,000 ships of various sizes maintained perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the advanced materials that made them nearly indestructible. The commander was confident, as he had every right to be. In his 3 centuries of service to the Zephyrian Empire, he had never lost a battle. His fleet had conquered 47 different species, from the crystal beings of Androxa Prime to the methane breathers of the Outer Rim. Each conquest had followed the same pattern: arrive, demonstrate superior technology, receive surrender. "Status report," he ordered, his forearms moving gracefully across the control surfaces of his command station. "All ships reporting ready, Commander," replied his tactical officer. "Energy shields at maximum efficiency, plasma cannons charged and ready. Long-range scanners show no sign of defensive preparations from the human homeworld." Thexmal's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. The humans were behaving exactly as expected. Their primitive technology couldn't even detect his fleet's approach, despite the fact that they were less than 2 light-years away. Their crude optical telescopes and radio receivers were useless against Zephyrian stealth technology. Display the intelligence report on human capabilities, he commanded. The main screen filled with data that his scouts had gathered over the past several cycles. The information was both detailed and disappointing. The humans possess no energy weapons beyond simple electrical devices. Their most powerful bombs relied on nuclear fission and fusion, technologies that the Empire had abandoned thousands of years ago as inefficient and messy. Their space vessels were laughably primitive, propelled by controlled chemical explosions and limited to speeds far below light. Their largest warships were made of crude steel and titanium alloys that would melt under the first blast from a Zephyrian plasma cannon. Most amusing of all were their weapons. The humans still used kinetic projectiles, literally throwing small pieces of metal at high speeds. Their military vehicles were essentially armored boxes that moved on wheels or tracks, like something a child might build from scrap metal. The intelligence report confirms our initial assessment, said his science officer, a thin Zephyrian with pale blue skin. The humans have not developed defensive shielding of any kind. Their electronic systems are vulnerable to even minimal electromagnetic interference. Their military doctrine appears to be based on primitive line-of-sight combat. Fexmal studied the data more carefully. The human military seemed to be organized around concepts that made little sense to him. They had multiple competing forces within each nation, and multiple competing nations across their planet. Their weapons were designed for fighting other humans, rather than defending against external threats. They have no unified command structure, he observed. Their response to our ultimatum will likely be chaotic and uncoordinated. This was standard for primitive species. The Empire had seen it countless times before. A divided civilization, focused on internal conflicts, suddenly faced with external threat they couldn't comprehend. Usually, they surrendered within hours of seeing a Zephyrian fleet. What about their nuclear weapons? Asked his tactical officer. Our scans detected significant radioactive signatures across their planet. Fexmal waved a dismissive hand. Crude atomic devices. We conquered species with similar technology 2,000 years ago. Our shields can absorb nuclear explosions without strain. Besides, they would never use such weapons against an orbital target. The radiation would contaminate their own planet. The science officer nodded in agreement. The humans appear to be emotionally attached to their homeworld in an irrational way. They will not risk damaging it, which limits their response options considerably. This was another pattern the Empire had observed. Most species valued their home planets above all else, making them easy to control through the threat of orbital bombardment. The humans would follow the same predictable course. Initial defiance, followed by desperate negotiation, ending in complete surrender. On the other side of the galaxy, however, human military leaders were having very different discussions. In the depths of Cheyenne Mountain, General Morrison pulled up classified files that hadn't been accessed in decades. The screens around him displayed information that would have terrified any sane person. Hidden missile silos scattered across 6 continents, submarine fleets carrying weapons that officially didn't exist, and orbital platforms disguised as communication satellites. Project Damocles is fully operational, reported Colonel Stevens, his aide. All hidden installations are responding to activation codes. The Moscow, Beijing, and London commands have confirmed their systems are online. General Morrison nodded grimly. During the Cold War, when nuclear annihilation seemed possible at any moment, military planners had developed contingencies for threats they could barely imagine. What if conventional deterrence failed? What if an enemy possessed technology that made traditional warfare obsolete? What if Earth faced a threat that required absolutely everything humanity could bring to bear? The answers to those questions had been classified above top secret, buried so deep that most world leaders didn't know they existed. But now, faced with an alien empire that thought kinetic weapons were primitive, those old plans suddenly seemed very relevant. What's the status on the Australian sites? Morrison asked. Fully operational, sir. The mining platforms have been converted as planned, We have 67 installations ready for immediate activation. Morrison allowed himself a small smile. The aliens had scanned Earth's surface and identified obvious military targets. What they hadn't found were the installations that had been built to be invisible, designed by engineers who assumed their enemies would have technology far beyond human understanding. Meanwhile, in submarine bases around the world, crews were receiving orders that many of them had hoped never to see. The message was simple and direct. Prepare for unconventional warfare against a technologically superior enemy. All previous rules of engagement were suspended. The only objective was to cause maximum damage to enemy forces by any means necessary. Captain Rodriguez, of the USS Leviathan, read his orders 3 times before believing them. His submarine carried 24 ballistic missiles, each equipped with multiple warheads. Officially, those warheads were equipped with conventional explosives. Unofficially, some of them contained surprises that had been developed during the darker days of the Cold War. Helm, bring us to launch depth. Prepare missiles 1 through 12 for immediate firing. Sir, his weapons officer said carefully, those missiles aren't equipped with standard warheads. I know exactly what they're equipped with, Rodriguez replied. And when those alien ships arrive, they're going to learn why humans kept building bigger bombs even after we had enough to destroy our own planet. Back on the Zephyrian fleet, Commander Thexmal was reviewing the final approach vectors. His ships would emerge from faster-than-light travel just beyond the human system's outer planets, giving them time to form battle lines and demonstrate their overwhelming superiority. The humans have had sufficient time to consider our Emperor's ultimatum, he announced to his officers. When we arrive, they will see the futility of resistance. Standard protocols will apply. Orbital bombardment of military targets, followed by demands for immediate surrender. His tactical officer brought up the target list. Sir, should we prioritize the larger population centers or the military installations? Military installations first, Thexmal decided. We want them to understand that their defenses are useless, but we should avoid excessive civilian casualties. The Emperor prefers to rule over living subjects rather than empty planets. It was a reasonable strategy that had worked perfectly for centuries. Demonstrate overwhelming force, eliminate the enemy's ability to fight back, then accept their surrender. Clean, efficient, and profitable. The commander had no way of knowing that on the planet below, human military leaders were preparing to show him something that no species in the galaxy had ever demonstrated before. How a technologically inferior force could defeat a superior enemy through pure, unrestrained aggression and tactics so brutal that they violated every convention of civilized warfare. The Zephyrian Empire was about to learn that in a galaxy full of advanced, peaceful civilizations, they had chosen to fight the one species that had never stopped preparing for war. The Zephyrian fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system with perfect precision. 1,000 warships materialized in formation, their hulls gleaming under the distant light of the human star. Commander Thexmal watched with satisfaction as his vessels assumed battle positions. All ships reporting successful transition, his navigation officer announced. Formation holding steady. Long-range scanners are active. Thexmal studied the tactical display showing the inner system. The third planet, Earth, appeared as a small blue dot, surrounded by the tiny specks that represented human orbital installations. Their largest space stations were smaller than his smallest escort vessels. Open a communication channel to the human homeworld, he ordered. Let us give them one final chance to surrender. The transmission began broadcasting on all frequencies that humans were known to use. Thexmal's image appeared on screens around the Earth, a tall, imposing figure with 4 arms and the ceremonial armor of a fleet commander. Primitive humans, he began, his voice carrying the authority of countless successful conquests. I am Fleet Commander Thexmal of the Zephyrian Galactic Empire. You have had sufficient time to consider Emperor Vexthan's generous offer. The time for surrender has arrived. In the Pentagon's war room, Admiral Chen and her staff watched the alien commander speak. His tone was exactly what they had expected, confident, superior, and completely dismissive of human capabilities. Your pathetic defenses cannot stand against our technology, Fexmal continued. Our energy shields will protect us from your crude weapons, while our plasma cannons reduce your cities to ash. However, the Emperor is merciful. Surrender now, and your lives will be spared. Admiral Chen stepped forward to respond. Around the room, her fellow officers watched intently. This moment would determine whether humanity faced conquest or war. Commander Fexmal, she began, her voice steady and professional. I am Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Defense Force. Your Emperor has indeed given us time to consider his offer. She paused, allowing a small smile to cross her face. We've decided to decline. However, since you've clearly done your homework on our conventional weapons, I'm curious. Did you happen to research our unconventional ones? On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Fexmal's mandibles clicked in annoyance. The human's response was exactly what he had expected. Defiant words from a primitive species that didn't understand the futility of their situation. Your threats are meaningless, he replied. Begin orbital bombardment of military targets. Show them what they face. The first wave of Zephyrion ships moved into attack position above Earth. Their plasma cannons charged, energy readings climbing to levels that should have terrified any watching human forces. The weapons were capable of melting through a mile of solid rock in seconds. But as the alien ships prepared to fire, something unexpected happened. Warning alarms began sounding on Zephyrion bridges as their sensors detected incoming projectiles. The objects were moving fast, but not impossibly so. They appeared to be primitive ballistic missiles of the type that the intelligence reports had described. Energy shields to maximum, Fexmal ordered calmly. Let them waste their ammunition. The first nuclear warheads detonated against Zephyrion shields, exactly as expected. The energy barriers absorbed the explosive force without difficulty, just as they had against similar weapons from dozens of other primitive species. But then something strange began to happen. Commander, his science officer reported, confusion evident in her voice. Our shield generators are experiencing unusual fluctuations. Explain, Fexmal demanded. The nuclear detonations are producing massive electromagnetic pulses. Our shields are designed to absorb energy, but they're not filtering out the electromagnetic effects. The pulses are interfering with our control systems. For the first time since the battle began, Fexmal felt a flicker of concern. No species had ever used nuclear weapons this way before. Most civilizations viewed atomic devices as crude planet killers, too dangerous to use in space combat. But the humans seemed to be using them specifically for their electromagnetic effects. Compensate for the interference. Continue bombardment. But the problems were just beginning. As more missiles reached the fleet, the electromagnetic chaos grew worse. Zephyrian computers, designed for perfect efficiency in controlled environments, began experiencing errors. Navigation systems flickered, weapon targeting became erratic. And then the real surprises began. Commander, his tactical officer shouted. Massive energy signatures approaching from multiple vectors. On the main screen, streaks of light appeared from locations throughout the solar system. The signatures didn't match anything in the intelligence reports. These weren't the crude chemical rockets that the scouts had observed. These projectiles were moving at incredible speeds, far beyond what human technology should have been capable of. What are those? Fexmal demanded. His science officer worked frantically at her console. The energy signatures suggest some form of magnetic acceleration, but the power requirements would be enormous. How could a primitive species? She never finished the sentence. The first kinetic projectiles struck the destroyer's Swift Victory amidships, punching through its energy shields as if they weren't there. The Zephyrian shields were designed to absorb energy weapons, plasma blasts, particle beams, directed energy of all kinds. They were not designed to stop solid objects moving at significant fractions of light speed. The tungsten rod, launched from a magnetic accelerator hidden in an Australian mining facility, carried more kinetic energy than most atomic weapons. It passed through the destroyer's shields, through its hull, and out the other side, leaving a perfectly round hole that vented atmosphere and electronics into space. Shield penetration, the tactical officer reported, his voice rising in panic. How is that possible? More projectiles followed. Railguns that had been disguised as mining equipment began firing from locations across the solar system. Each shot was a simple piece of metal, accelerated to tremendous velocity. But the combined kinetic energy was devastating. The Zephyrian fleet, which had never encountered weapons that simply ignored their defenses, began to take serious damage. "Return fire," Fexmal ordered. "Target the source of those projectiles." But targeting the human weapons proved nearly impossible. The railguns were hidden in installations that looked like ordinary industrial facilities. Some were built into asteroid mining platforms. Others were concealed in deep ocean trenches on Earth itself. Worse, the humans seemed to be using tactics that made no sense to Zephyrian military doctrine. Instead of trying to protect their weapons, they were sacrificing them deliberately. As soon as a railgun fired, its crew would abandon it and detonate explosive charges that destroyed the facility. "They're destroying their own weapons," the tactical officer reported in bewilderment. "Why would they do that?" Fexmal had no answer. In Zephyrian warfare, weapons were valuable assets to be protected. The idea of deliberately destroying your own equipment after a single use was incomprehensible. But for humans, who had spent centuries perfecting the art of warfare, it made perfect sense. The railguns had been built for exactly this purpose. One shot each, maximum damage, then destroy the evidence. It was better to eliminate a dozen enemy ships and lose your weapon than to keep your weapon and eliminate none. As the battle continued, more surprises revealed themselves. Submarines that had launched their nuclear missiles continued firing with conventional ballistic weapons. But these weren't ordinary missiles. Some carried payloads designed specifically to interfere with advanced electronics. Others released clouds of metallic particles that disrupted energy weapons. And some carried warheads that the humans had developed during their darkest military research programs. Weapons so unpleasant that they had been classified beyond top secret and hidden away in case they were ever needed against an enemy that conventional forces couldn't stop. "Commander," his communications officer reported, her voice tight with fear. "We're receiving damage reports from across the fleet. 17 ships destroyed, 43 severely damaged. Our formations are breaking apart." Fexmal stared at the tactical display in disbelief. In less than 30 minutes, his perfectly organized fleet had been reduced to chaos by a species that shouldn't have been able to scratch the paint on his warships. How is this possible? The answer was simple, though the commander couldn't comprehend it. The Zephyrian Empire had spent millennia conquering peaceful species that developed technology for exploration and improvement. They had never encountered a civilization that developed technology specifically for warfare. Humanity had been at war with itself for its entire existence. Every human weapon, from the sharpest spear to the most advanced missile, had been designed by people who understood that the enemy would try to defend against it. Human military technology wasn't just about building bigger guns. It was about building guns that could defeat any possible defense. The Zephyrians had energy shields, so humans built kinetic weapons. The Zephyrians had advanced electronics, so humans built electromagnetic pulse devices. The Zephyrians expected rational, defensive tactics, so humans used suicide attacks and deliberate self-destruction. On Earth, Admiral Chen watched the battle unfold with grim satisfaction. The first phase was going exactly as planned. The aliens had been caught completely off guard by human tactics that prioritized damage over survival. Phase 2 is ready to commence, General Martinez reported. All stealth units are in position. Chen nodded. The real fight was just beginning. Phase 1 had been about showing the aliens that their technology wasn't invincible. Phase 2 would teach them something far more important, that humans didn't just fight to win. They fought to make sure their enemies never wanted to fight them again. Fleet Commander Thexmal stood amid the chaos of his command bridge, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Warning lights flashed across every console, damage reports flooded in from ships throughout his fleet, and his tactical officers struggled to track enemies that seemed to appear from nowhere. "Status report," he demanded, his voice carrying a note of desperation he had never heard from himself before. 31 ships destroyed, 67 damaged, his tactical officer replied, her hands shaking as she worked her controls. "We're detecting new enemy contacts on 17 different vectors. Sir, they're not using any formation we recognize." That was the problem. In 3 centuries of conquest, Thexmal had faced many different species, but their military tactics had always followed logical patterns. Ships stayed together for mutual protection. Commanders positioned their forces to maximize firepower while minimizing risk. Retreat was considered when losses became unsustainable. The humans were doing none of these things. Instead of maintaining formation, human ships scattered across the solar system like insects. Instead of protecting their vessels, they were deliberately ramming them into Zephyrian warships. Instead of retreating when damaged, they seemed to become more aggressive. "Sir," his science officer called out, her voice filled with confusion. "We're tracking a human vessel on an intercept course with the Glorious Dawn. It appears to be a converted cargo ship with no weapons." "A cargo ship?" Thexmal repeated. "What possible threat could—" The cargo ship exploded against the Glorious Dawn's shields, in a blast that registered on sensors across the solar system. When the energy cleared, both vessels were gone. "What was that?" Thexmal demanded. "The cargo ship was carrying some form of antimatter device," his science officer reported, her voice barely a whisper. "The explosion was equivalent to— Sir, it was equivalent to a small star going supernova. Antimatter weapons weren't unknown to the Zephyrian Empire, but they were considered too dangerous for practical use. The risk of accidentally destroying your own forces was enormous. No sane military commander would put antimatter devices on unshielded cargo ships operated by suicide crews. But humans, apparently, were not sane by galactic standards." "More incoming contacts," the tactical officer announced. "These appear to be small fighter craft, but they're moving in attack patterns that make no sense. They're not trying to avoid our fire." Thexmal watched in growing horror as swarms of human fighters dove directly into his fleet's defensive fire. Most were destroyed before they could reach their targets, but the few that survived delivered payloads that seemed designed specifically to cause maximum chaos. Some fighters carried electronic warfare devices that jammed Zephyrian communications. Others released clouds of reflective particles that made targeting nearly impossible. A few carried what appeared to be primitive nuclear devices that detonated in the middle of ship formations, creating electromagnetic storms that disrupted everything within miles. And some fighters simply rammed into Zephyrian vessels at full speed, their pilots making no attempt to escape before impact. "They're committing suicide," his communications officer said, her voice filled with disbelief. "Their pilots are dying on purpose." This was beyond anything in Zephyrian military experience. In their wars of conquest, individual soldiers might die for strategic reasons, but deliberate suicide attacks were unthinkable. The idea that a species would train its warriors to die on purpose was horrifying. But for humans, who had studied warfare for thousands of years, suicide attacks were simply another tool in their arsenal. Kamikaze pilots in World War II had proven their effectiveness. Martyrdom operations had shown how a small force could damage a much larger one. The concept was simple. If your death can eliminate a target worth more than your life, then dying becomes a rational choice. The Zephyrian fleet's artificial intelligence systems, designed to predict enemy behavior based on logical self-interest, couldn't process human tactics that deliberately ignored self-preservation. Sir, the tactical officer announced, we're detecting massive movement throughout the enemy system. They appear to be launching everything they have. Define everything, Thexmal ordered. Military vessels, cargo ships, civilian transports, orbital platforms, asteroid mining equipment. Sir, they've even weaponized their communications satellites. Everything in their system that can move is heading toward our position. This violated every principle of military science that Dexmol understood. You didn't throw civilian assets into combat. You didn't convert industrial equipment into weapons. You didn't sacrifice your entire space infrastructure for a single battle. Unless you were a species that viewed warfare as total conflict, where anything that could hurt the enemy was a legitimate weapon. On Earth, Admiral Chen coordinated the chaos with the calm efficiency of someone who had planned for exactly this scenario. Around her, screens displayed the positions of thousands of human vessels, platforms, and installations, all converging on the alien fleet. Civilian evacuation is complete, reported General Martinez. All non-essential personnel have been moved to hardened shelters. We're ready for Phase 3. Phase 3 was the most dangerous part of the plan, because it involved revealing weapons that humanity had hoped never to use. Activate the Prometheus platforms, she ordered. Deep in hidden bunkers around the world, machines that had been built during the darkest days of the Cold War came online. They had been designed by engineers who were asked a simple question: what if we needed to destroy an entire planet? The answer was the Prometheus system, a network of orbital platforms disguised as debris, each carrying a device that could crack a planet's crust. They had been built as the ultimate deterrent, weapons so terrible that merely possessing them was supposed to prevent any war from ever reaching the point where they would be needed. Now they were being aimed not at planets, but at the largest ships in the Zephyrian fleet. The first Prometheus device activated near the Zephyrian flagship, Eternal Dominion. What appeared to be a piece of space junk suddenly unfolded into a complex mechanism that began drawing power from a fusion reactor that had been hidden inside an asteroid. Sir, the science officer on Bexmal's bridge screamed. Massive energy buildup detected off our starboard side. The beam that struck the Eternal Dominion was unlike anything the Zephyrians had ever seen. It didn't just penetrate their shields, it seemed to phase right through them, as if the shields weren't there at all. The energy tore through the ship's hull like paper, gutting the massive vessel from stem to stern. How? Thexmal whispered as his flagship shuddered around him. How did they penetrate our defenses? The answer was typically human. The Prometheus weapons didn't try to overwhelm Zephyrian shields or find gaps in their defenses. Instead, they used a principle that the aliens had never encountered. The weapons existed partially outside normal space, allowing them to ignore conventional defensive measures. Human scientists had developed the technology by studying theoretical physics that most species considered too dangerous to research. The weapons worked by creating small tears in reality itself, allowing energy to travel through dimensions that shields couldn't protect. It was the kind of weapon that only a species with a deep understanding of warfare would even think to build. All ships, emergency retreat, Thexmal ordered, as his bridge filled with smoke and sparks. Fall back to minimum safe distance. But retreat proved impossible. Human forces had surrounded the Zephyrian fleet, using tactics that prioritized speed and confusion over safety. Small, fast ships darted between the alien vessels, making it impossible to target them without risking friendly fire. Larger human ships positioned themselves so that any escape route would require the Zephyrians to fight their way through multiple defensive lines. And everywhere, more human vessels appeared from hiding places throughout the solar system. Some emerged from behind asteroids where they had been waiting for days. Others rose from the surfaces of planets and moons, revealing that humanity had militarized every body in their system. Sir, his communications officer reported, her voice breaking, we're receiving a transmission from the human admiral. Admiral Chen's face appeared on the main screen. She looked calm, professional, and completely in control of the situation. Commander Fexmal, she began, I wanted to discuss the terms of your surrender. Surrender? Fexmal repeated, unable to process the words. We are the Zephyrian Empire. We have conquered hundreds of worlds. Yes, Chen replied with a slight smile, and that's exactly why you're going to lose this war. You've conquered peaceful species that develop technology for exploration and growth. You've never fought a species that developed technology specifically for warfare. She gestured to something off-screen, and the tactical display showed the true scope of human preparations. Hidden installations throughout the solar system, weapons platforms that had been disguised as industrial equipment, and ship production facilities that had been secretly converted for military use. Every human military leader has studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Napoleon, and dozens of other conquerors, Chen continued. We've read about Thermopylae, Hastings, Gettysburg, and Stalingrad. We've analyzed every major battle in our history, looking for ways to defeat superior forces through strategy, tactics, and pure determination. Fexmal stared at the screen, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. You thought we were primitive because we still use kinetic weapons, Chen said. But we use kinetic weapons because we know they work. You thought we were weak because we don't have energy shields. But we don't need shields. We have something better. What? Fexmal whispered. Chen's smile grew wider and much more dangerous. We have experience. 3 weeks after the Zephyrian fleet arrived in the Sol system, Emperor Vexthan sat in his private chambers, staring at reports he could barely believe. Of the 1,000 ships he had sent to conquer humanity, fewer than 200 remained. The rest were either destroyed or captured by human forces. Captured. The word itself was almost impossible to accept. In the Empire's entire history of conquest, no enemy had ever captured Zephyrian vessels. Their ships were too advanced, their crews too well-trained, their technology too superior. Yet somehow, primitive humans using crude kinetic weapons had done exactly that. The reports made no sense. Human boarding parties had used simple explosive devices to breach Zephyrian hulls, then fought ship-to-ship combat using projectile weapons and hand-to-hand fighting. It should have been laughable. Soldiers with metal weapons against crews equipped with energy shields and plasma rifles. Instead, it had been a massacre. Human soldiers fought with a level of aggression and tactical skill that Zephyrian crews couldn't match. They used their ship's own corridors against them, turning every passage into a killing zone. They sabotaged critical systems with crude but effective explosives. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to welcome close combat in a way that terrified civilized beings. But the loss of his fleet was only the beginning of the Emperor's problems. Your Imperial Majesty, his communications minister announced nervously. We're receiving reports from our border systems. Human forces have been detected in Zephyrian space. Vexthan's 4 eyes focused on the minister with deadly intensity. Explain. The humans appear to have reverse-engineered our faster-than-light drive technology from captured vessels, the minister continued, his voice barely above a whisper. They've modified their own ships with the systems and begun expansion operations. The Emperor stood from his throne, his massive frame casting shadows across the chamber. Expansion operations? They're attacking our outposts, Your Majesty, but they're not using conventional tactics. They're employing the same strategies they used against Fleet Commander Fexmal's forces. This was impossible. No species in the galaxy's history had ever launched counterattacks against the Zephyrian Empire. Even the most technologically advanced civilizations had been content to negotiate surrender terms after their initial defeat. Show me, the Emperor commanded. The main display activated, showing the most recent intelligence reports from the border systems. What Vexthan saw defied everything he understood about galactic warfare. Human ships were indeed operating in Zephyrian space, but they weren't behaving like any enemy the Empire had ever faced. Instead of attempting to conquer territory or establish permanent bases, they seemed focused on causing maximum damage and terror. Human raiders would appear without warning at remote outposts, destroy everything they could find, then disappear before reinforcements could arrive. They targeted supply lines, communication networks, and civilian shipping with equal ruthlessness. Most disturbing of all, they were using captured Zephyrian technology in ways that its original designers had never imagined. "They've weaponized our own cargo vessels," the intelligence minister reported. "They load them with nuclear devices and ram them into our stations. They've converted our communication arrays into electromagnetic pulse weapons. They're using our own medical supplies to create biological warfare agents." Emperor Vexthon sank back into his throne as the full scope of the disaster became clear. The humans weren't just defending their territory. They were teaching the galaxy what total warfare looked like. In the captured Zephyrian command ship that now served as her flagship, Admiral Chen reviewed the latest reports from human strike forces operating throughout the Empire. The ship had been renamed Righteous Fury, and its bridge now bustled with human officers who were quickly adapting alien technology to their own purposes. "Strike Force Alpha has successfully destroyed the supply depot at Kepler Station," reported Captain Williams, her new tactical officer. "Strike Force Beta eliminated a Zephyrian patrol fleet in the Outer Rim. No survivors." Chen nodded approvingly. The human counterattack was proceeding exactly as planned. While the Zephyrian Empire had expected humanity to negotiate after their initial defeat, human military leaders had instead decided to demonstrate why starting a war with humanity was the worst mistake any species could make. "Any word from the Emperor?" she asked. "He's been broadcasting surrender offers for the past week," Williams replied. "He's offering full diplomatic recognition, trade agreements, even tribute payments if we'll stop our attacks." Chen smiled coldly. The Emperor clearly didn't understand how human warfare worked. When an enemy attacked humanity, the conflict didn't end when they decided they'd had enough. It ended when humanity decided the enemy had been punished sufficiently to never try again. "Ignore his transmissions," she ordered. "Continue operations as planned." The human campaign was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Where other species fought to achieve specific political goals, humans fought to completely break their enemy's will to resist. They didn't just want to win the current conflict, they wanted to make sure no one would ever threaten humanity again. Human strike forces had been trained in tactics developed over centuries of warfare on Earth. They used psychological warfare to spread terror among Zephyrian populations. They targeted civilian infrastructure to demonstrate that nowhere in the Empire was safe. They employed captured enemies as sources of intelligence and propaganda. Most importantly, they showed no mercy to anyone who had supported the attack on Earth. "Admiral," her communications officer announced, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Emperor Vexthon himself." "Put it through," Chen ordered. The Emperor's image appeared on the main screen. He looked older than in his previous transmissions, his 4 eyes showing a level of stress that Chen found quite satisfying. "Admiral Chen," he began, his voice carrying none of its previous arrogance, "I am prepared to offer terms for ending this conflict. The Zephyrian Empire formally recognizes human sovereignty and agrees to pay substantial reparations for our unprovoked attack." Chen let him finish before responding. "Your Imperial Majesty," she said, her voice carrying the same cold professionalism she had used at the war's beginning. "I appreciate your offer. However, there seems to be some confusion about the current situation." Vexthan's expression showed genuine puzzlement. "Confusion? You seem to believe that this is a negotiation between equals," Chen continued. "It's not. This is a lesson in human military philosophy. You attacked us because you thought we were weak. Now we're demonstrating exactly how strong we actually are." The Emperor's face showed growing alarm. "What are your terms for peace?" Chen's smile was cold enough to freeze helium. "Peace? Your Imperial Majesty, you declared war on humanity. You threatened to destroy our homeworld and enslave our people. You said we were primitive and weak." She leaned forward in her chair. "You wanted to teach us about galactic warfare. Now we're teaching you about human warfare. Class is in session." The transmission continued for several more minutes, with the Emperor growing increasingly desperate as Chen outlined the scope of human operations throughout his empire. Human forces weren't just raiding border systems. They were systematically dismantling the infrastructure that had allowed the Zephyrian Empire to function for centuries. More importantly, they were sharing their technology and tactics with other species that the Empire had conquered. Rebellion was spreading throughout Zephyrian space, as subjugated worlds learned that the supposedly invincible Empire could be defeated by a single planet of determined humans. Your empire, Chen explained patiently, was built on the assumption that technological superiority guarantees military victory. You conquered peaceful species that had never learned to fight effectively. Now you're discovering what happens when you face a species that has been perfecting warfare for its entire existence. The Emperor made one last desperate plea. What will it take for you to stop? Chen considered the question carefully. Around the bridge, her officers waited to hear the terms that would end the war that had already reshaped the balance of power in the galaxy. Unconditional surrender, she said finally. Complete disarmament of all Zephyrian military forces. Release of all conquered territories. And formal recognition that humanity is now the dominant military power in this galaxy. She paused, then added the final condition that would ensure this lesson was never forgotten. And you will establish a monument on your capital world, commemorating the day the Zephyrian Empire learned never to underestimate humanity again. Emperor Vexthan's face showed the defeat of someone who had finally understood that he had awakened something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The humans weren't just another species to be conquered. They were the galaxy's apex predators, and they had been sleeping peacefully until he made the mistake of provoking them. We accept your terms, he whispered. Admiral Chen nodded with satisfaction. Excellent. Welcome to the new Galactic Order, your former Imperial Majesty. You wanted to see what happens when an advanced civilization meets a primitive one. Her smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. Congratulations, you just found out. The war that had begun with alien laughter at human primitiveness ended with the most powerful empire in the galaxy surrendering unconditionally to a single planet that had never lost its taste for warfare. And across the galaxy, every species that had watched the conflict learned a simple lesson that would shape interstellar politics for centuries to come. Never, ever start a fight with humanity. The humans might use primitive weapons, but they had perfected something far more dangerous than any energy cannon or plasma rifle. They had perfected the art of war itself.